The call came at 11:17 on a Thursday morning while I was standing in the museum's records room checking the condition report on a 19th century desk. I almost let it go to voicemail because I didn't recognize the number. I answered only because it had the same area code as my grandmother's town. "Is this Mara Ellison?" a man asked. When I said yes, he introduced himself as Caleb Warren and then said something that made me put down my clipboard. "I'm buying Rose Ellison's house, and the closing company is still waiting on your signature." For a few seconds, I assumed he had the wrong Mara Ellison. My parents had told me 3 days earlier that Grandma's house was sold, not listed, not under negotiation, sold. My mother had actually sounded relieved when she called me. She said they had found a serious buyer, the inspection had gone well, and everyone could finally stop worrying about taxes, yard work, and what to do with an empty house. There had been no mention of me signing anything. "I think there's been a mistake," I told Caleb. "That house belongs to my parents." He paused, not dramatically, just long enough that I noticed. "I don't want to get in the middle of anything," he said, "but your name is on one of the required consent pages." I stepped out of the records room and into the hallway. Required for what? For the transfer. I leaned against the wall. "I haven't seen any transfer documents." Another pause. "I was under the impression your approval was being finalized." That wording bothered me more than it probably should have. Not that they were waiting for me. That somebody had apparently told him I was already on my way to saying yes. I asked him not to explain anything he wasn't comfortable explaining. I just wanted to know one thing. "Are you absolutely sure the name is Mara Ellison?" He read my full legal name back to me. I thanked him, hung up, and immediately called my mother. Elaine answered on the third ring. "Hey honey, I'm running into the grocery store. Can I call you back?" A man named Caleb Warren just called me. Silence. Then, the buyer. "Apparently. Why is he calling you?" Her question came too quickly. "He says closing needs my signature." My mother exhaled like I had just reminded her of an overdue dentist appointment. "Oh, that. It's some old estate technicality your grandmother put in place years ago. I thought the closing people were handling it." "What technicality?" "Mara, I honestly don't remember the language. Your grandmother loved complicated paperwork." I stared through the glass doors at a group of schoolkids following a docent through the lobby downstairs. "Did you know I had to sign?" "We knew they might need something from you." "That isn't what I asked." She went quiet. My mother wasn't someone who usually struggled for an answer. Elaine Ellison could organize a holiday dinner for 22 people, remember who had a nut allergy, and tell you which cousin still owed her a casserole dish from Easter. Silence from her meant something. Finally she said, "The house is costing money every month it sits there. We have a good buyer. There's no reason to turn a simple sale into a bigger thing than it needs to be." "I'm not turning it into anything. I'm asking why someone told the buyer my approval was being finalized when nobody asked me to approve anything." Her voice tightened just slightly. "Just sign it when they send it, Mara. We've handled everything else." That sentence should have reassured me. For most of my life, it probably would have. My parents handled things. I was the daughter who didn't create unnecessary problems. When Mom said something had been taken care of, I usually believed her. But Caleb hadn't said they might need my signature. He had said they were still waiting for it. After we hung up, I called him back. "Could you send me the page with my name on it?" I asked. "Just that page. I'm not asking you for anything else." 10 minutes later an email appeared in my inbox. I opened the attachment at my desk and found my name printed above a blank signature line. There was no signature there, mine or anyone else's. But directly above my name were 4 words I read 3 times before they made any more sense than they had the first time: required consenting interest holder. I sat back in my chair. I didn't know exactly what that meant. I did know it was not the same thing as random relative who needs to sign an old form, And then I remembered something I hadn't thought about since before Grandma died. A blue folder she had handed me one afternoon and told me to keep somewhere safe. I had put it in the fireproof box in my apartment without reading more than the first page. For the rest of that workday, I kept thinking about that folder. By the time I got home, I wasn't wondering whether my mother had forgotten to explain something. I was wondering what Grandma had known that I didn't. The blue folder was exactly where I remembered leaving it, underneath my passport, and a stack of old insurance papers in the fireproof box at the back of my bedroom closet. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it expecting to find something obvious now that I knew what I was looking for. Instead, the first few pages were painfully ordinary: a property description, tax records, copies of documents with stamps and signatures I didn't understand, and an amendment dated almost 4 years earlier. I nearly skipped that one. Then I saw my full name halfway down the page. I read the paragraph once, then again more slowly. I wasn't suddenly the secret owner of Grandma's house. Nothing in the folder said that. My mother still had a much larger interest in how the property was handled. But the amendment said that a voluntary transfer of the property required written consent from an additional interest holder. That person was me. I took out the page Caleb had emailed and placed it beside Grandma's copy. The language wasn't identical, but the connection was obvious enough that I stopped trying to convince myself this was some meaningless clerical requirement. Grandma had put my name there deliberately. What I couldn't understand was why. I called Mom again. This time I skipped the small talk. I found Grandma's amendment. There was a short silence. Which amendment? The one that says I have to consent before the house is voluntarily transferred. Mara, you're reading legal language without context. Then give me the context. She sighed. Your grandmother became overly cautious about everything toward the end. She wanted extra names on things, extra checks, extra paperwork. It made her feel better. So you knew about it? Of course I knew about it. I've been dealing with that property for months. That answer landed harder than I expected. That morning she had called it an old technicality she barely remembered. Now she knew enough to have an opinion about why Grandma created it. Did you know you needed my consent before you listed the house? I asked. Mom didn't answer immediately. Then she said, we knew your signature would eventually be needed. There's a difference. What difference? The difference between making a practical decision and dragging every person into every step of it. We found a buyer. The offer is fair, the inspection is done. You're acting like something was taken from you. I'm trying to figure out what I'm being asked to approve. You're being asked to let us sell an empty house. Her tone wasn't cruel. If anything, that made the conversation more unsettling. She sounded genuinely frustrated that I couldn't see how simple this was. Grandma gave me that authority for some reason, I said. Your grandmother didn't trust anybody to make a simple decision without adding 3 layers of protection. Including you? Another silence. I have to go, Mara. After she hung up, I stayed at the table with the documents spread in front of me. I wasn't angry enough to call her back. I was too busy noticing the contradictions. Mom had known my consent was required. She had listed the house anyway. She had accepted an offer. The buyer had been told my approval was coming, and at no point had anyone actually asked me. I started going through the folder page by page, this time without skipping anything. Most of it gave me nothing useful. There were copies of tax bills, an old survey, receipts for repairs, even a handwritten list of paint colors Grandma had used downstairs. Near the back, tucked behind the property amendment, I found a cream-colored envelope. My name was written across the front in Grandma's handwriting. I recognized the slight rightward slant immediately. Underneath my name she had written one sentence. Read this before you agree to anything about the house. I sat there for several seconds with my thumb under the flap. Grandma had given me the folder about a year before she died. She hadn't been dramatic about it. We had been drinking coffee at her kitchen table when she pushed it toward me and told me to put it with my important papers. I had asked whether I needed to do anything with it. She said, "Not unless somebody asks you to." At the time, I thought she meant taxes or some administrative form after she was gone. Now somebody was asking me to sign. I opened the envelope. The letter inside was only 2 pages long. The first paragraph surprised me because Grandma seemed to anticipate exactly the conclusion I was about to jump to. She wasn't asking me to preserve the house forever. She wrote that houses were possessions, not monuments, and that keeping one out of guilt could be just as foolish as selling one carelessly. If selling made sense someday, she wanted me to sell. Then the letter changed. Grandma wrote that our family had a habit of making permanent decisions whenever a temporary problem became frightening enough. My mother, especially, was good at solving emergencies quickly. Grandma admired that about her, but she didn't always trust the cost. She didn't give me a list of old arguments or accuse Mom of anything. Instead, she gave me 2 questions. Before I ever agreed to sell the house, Grandma wanted me to ask why now, and where does the money go? I read those lines twice. Then I looked around my apartment at the papers covering my kitchen table. I knew the house had taxes. I knew it needed maintenance. I knew my parents had found a buyer. But suddenly, I realized something embarrassingly basic. I couldn't answer either of Grandma's questions. I didn't know why the sale had to happen now, and I had absolutely no idea where the money was supposed to go. The next morning, I called June Patel before I called either of my parents. June had lived next door to Grandma for almost 25 years, and the 2 of them had the kind of friendship built around spare keys, borrowed ladders, and knowing when the other person's porch light should have been on. I didn't tell June about Caleb or the missing signature. I only asked whether Grandma had ever talked to her about selling the house. "Selling it someday?" June asked. "Or your mother wanting her to sell it?" That distinction made me sit straighter. I asked what she meant. June hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing something Grandma had never told me herself. Then she explained that several years earlier, Mom had suggested Grandma borrow against the house to help with a family business opportunity. Grandma had refused. June didn't know the numbers, and I didn't ask her to guess. What she remembered was Grandma's reasoning. "Rose said your mother was very good at finding money when somebody needed saving," June told me. "She just didn't think the house should become an emergency fund every time the family got nervous." That sounded almost exactly like the letter on my kitchen table. I asked whether Grandma had been angry with Mom. "No," June said. "Worried, maybe. Your grandmother understood your mother better than most people did." Then June mentioned something else. Not long after Grandma died, she had seen Mom at the house with 2 men measuring rooms and checking windows. June assumed they were contractors until a for sale sign appeared later. "How long after she died?" I asked. June couldn't give me an exact date, but she was certain it had been soon. I thanked her and ended the call before the conversation turned into family gossip. I wanted facts, not a collection of reasons to be angry. At work that afternoon, during my lunch break, I pulled up the property listing on my phone. The dates were easy to find once I bothered looking. The house had gone on the market 9 days after Mom told me. "We haven't decided what we're doing with Grandma's place yet." I remembered that conversation because I had offered to spend a weekend helping sort the remaining boxes. Mom had told me there was no rush. Apparently, there had been enough of a rush to prepare a listing. I scrolled farther. The listing emphasized flexibility for a fast closing. That phrase stuck with me. Grandma's first question had been why now, I was beginning to think. Because the house costs money. Wasn't the real answer. I drove to my parents' house that evening without warning them first. Dad was clearing dinner plates when I arrived. Mom was at the kitchen island answering an email. I put my phone down between them with the listing date visible. "I'm not here to fight," I said. "I need to understand the timeline." Mom looked at the screen and then at me. We started exploring options before we made a final decision. You listed it because we wanted to know what kind of interest there was. And then you accepted an offer without asking me. Dad stopped stacking plates. Mom folded her arms. Mara, nobody was trying to hide the house from you. You knew we planned to deal with it eventually. Eventually isn't 9 days after telling me there was no decision. Mom started explaining the taxes again, then the roof, the yard, the insurance. None of those things were fake problems. The house was nearly 70 years old, and leaving it empty indefinitely made no sense. 6 months earlier, those explanations probably would have satisfied me, but Grandma hadn't told me to ask whether selling was reasonable. She had told me to ask why now, so I did. Why does it have to close this month? Dad looked at Mom before he looked at me. It was a tiny movement, but I noticed it because I spent my working life noticing when one piece of a record didn't match the others. It doesn't have to, Mom said. It's simply better if it does. Better for who? Everyone. That isn't an answer. Mom pushed her laptop aside. What do you want from us, Mara? We have a qualified buyer. The price is reasonable. Nobody is stealing anything. Nobody is trying to cheat you. Then tell me what happens if I don't sign this month. Dad pulled out a chair and sat down. Mom stayed standing. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. That silence answered something before either of them did. The deadline mattered. Finally Dad rubbed one hand over his forehead. It affects Nolan. My older brother owned a specialty food business that had done well enough for years that I barely thought of it as risky anymore. The previous spring, he had opened a second location across town. Mom had talked about it constantly at first. Lately, I realized, she hadn't mentioned it at all. What does Nolan have to do with Grandma's house? I asked. Mom answered this time. The second location wasn't performing the way they had expected. Costs were higher, sales were lower, and there was a credit obligation coming due near the end of the month. We're trying to keep a temporary problem from becoming a permanent one, she said. The wording was so close to Grandma's letter that for a moment I just stared at her. Dad quietly added, the closing would give us more options. Us, not Nolan. I looked at him. What do you mean us? Mom's expression changed. Not panic. Calculation. She was deciding how much I needed to know. That was when I understood the house wasn't simply being sold because nobody wanted it. My parents needed it sold by a particular date, and whatever Nolan had gotten himself into, they were already part of it. How much money are you personally responsible for? I asked. Dad looked down at the table. Mom answered without giving me a number. That isn't what you need to decide. And suddenly, I knew the number wasn't the only thing they had been keeping from me. I stayed at the kitchen table because leaving would have let my parents turn another unanswered question into something we could discuss later. Mom finally sat across from me. Dad remained beside her, but the space between them suddenly felt larger than it had when I walked in. My signature is part of the solution, I said. Then I need to know what problem I'm signing on to. Mom shook her head. You're not signing on to Nolan's business. You're consenting to a property sale. A property sale you need completed before his credit deadline. Dad looked at his hands. Mom said, the two things overlap. That doesn't make the sale a bad decision. She wasn't wrong, which was what made the conversation difficult. Grandma's house was empty. It cost money. Selling it could still be sensible, even if my parents also needed cash. But those were two different decisions, and Mom kept presenting them as one. I looked at Dad. You said the closing gives us more options. What are you exposed to? He glanced at Mom again. We put some money into the expansion. How much? Enough that we don't want to see the second location fail? Mom said. That still isn't a number. Because the number isn't the point. It became the point when you expected me to sign without knowing it. Mom leaned back. Do you understand that Nolan has employees, suppliers, a lease? This isn't just your brother wanting a nicer storefront. If things tighten enough, other people feel it. That was the first thing she said all evening that made me hesitate. I knew some of Nolan's employees. One woman had worked with him since he started selling sauces and prepared foods out of a rented commercial kitchen. If the business was genuinely close to collapsing, I couldn't pretend the consequences stopped at our family. "What happens at the end of the month?" I asked. Dad finally answered. "A credit obligation has to be addressed. If we reduce it, Nolan has room to restructure instead of making decisions under pressure. And Grandma's house pays it. It gives us liquidity." Mom corrected. "That's different. Where does the sale money go?" The question came directly from Grandma's letter. Mom didn't know that yet. Her face tightened anyway. "Some of it resolves the business issue. The rest stays where it belongs." "How much is some?" "Mara, how much?" Dad started to speak, but Mom cut in. "This is exactly why we didn't drag you into every conversation from the beginning. You take one question and turn it into 12. I almost laughed, because I suddenly understood something about our family that I had never considered a problem before. Mom made decisions quickly, Dad avoided arguments, and I was useful because I usually accepted the finished version. "Then I'm going to make one decision tonight," I said. "I'm not signing anything tonight." Mom stared at me. "The buyer may not wait forever." "Then he doesn't wait forever. And if delaying this costs people jobs." "I'm not saying no to selling the house. I'm saying no to signing before I know what I'm agreeing to." Dad looked relieved, which told me more than anything he had said. Mom looked frustrated. "You're treating us like we've done something dishonest. You listed a property knowing my consent was required. You accepted an offer. The buyer thought my approval was already being handled. And I found out because he called me. What would you call that?" Nobody answered. I left 20 minutes later with no number, no complete explanation, and one new certainty. My parents' financial connection to Nolan's business went beyond the small investment Mom wanted me to picture. I called Nolan from my car before driving home. He didn't answer, so I left a short message asking him to call me directly. I didn't mention Mom or accuse him of anything. I just said I needed to understand what was happening with the second location. His text came before I reached my apartment. "I'm closing up. Can I call tomorrow?" Then a second message appeared. "Mom said there's some issue with Grandma's sale. Is that what this is about?" I typed back that it was. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally another message arrived. "I didn't know they were asking you to sign anything. I read it twice at a red light. Until then, I had assumed Nolan was somewhere in the background waiting for Mom and Dad to solve his problem. Now I wasn't sure he even knew what solution they had chosen. When I got home, I opened my laptop and made a list. I needed the current sales statement. I needed an independent appraisal so I could tell whether speed was affecting the price. I needed to know exactly how much of the proceeds my parents intended to put toward Nolan's business. Most importantly, I needed the dates. When had they committed themselves financially? When had they decided Grandma's house would be part of the solution? I emailed the list to both my parents. At the bottom I wrote one sentence. "I'll consider the sale when I have enough information to make the decision Grandma required me to make." Mom replied 11 minutes later. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be." I stared at that sentence for a while. Then I took Grandma's letter from the blue folder and reread the 2 questions she had left me. Why now? Where does the money go? For the first time, I thought maybe Grandma hadn't made the paperwork complicated at all. Maybe she had simply known that, in our family, asking one more question was sometimes the only way to stop a decision from becoming inevitable before everyone involved even knew it had been made. Mom sent the signature page again at 7:06 the next morning. No appraisal, no business numbers, no explanation of where the proceeds were going, just the attachment and one sentence. "If you sign today, we can still put all of this behind us." I called her instead of replying. I'm not signing today. Mara, the buyer has already spent money on inspections. Then he deserves to know the transaction isn't ready. It is ready. You're the only thing holding it up. There it was. The version of the story where everything had been properly decided and I had arrived at the end to create a problem. I kept my voice even. Send me the closing statement, the proposed distribution of the proceeds, and the information I asked for about Nolan's business. I'm also getting an independent appraisal. An appraisal? We already had one? Then mine should confirm yours. Mom went quiet. You don't trust us. Right now, I trust the documents I've actually seen. She ended the call soon after that. Nolan called 20 minutes later. I expected him to sound angry. Instead, he sounded exhausted. What exactly are Mom and Dad asking you to do? He asked. Consent to selling Grandma's house. I know that part now. I mean, why are you involved? I explained the amendment as simply as I could. Nolan swore under his breath, then apologized. I didn't know Grandma did that. Did you ask Mom and Dad to sell the house? No. His answer was immediate. I asked them for help getting through the next few months. I thought Dad was talking to the bank and maybe moving some investments around. Mom said they had options. I sat down at my desk. Did they tell you sale proceeds from Grandma's house were going into the business? Not until yesterday. How bad is the second location? Nolan took a few seconds before answering. Bad enough that opening it when I did was a mistake. Not bad enough that I want Mom and Dad doing something crazy to keep it alive. That was the first time anyone in the family had described the expansion as a mistake, without immediately adding a reason why someone else needed to fix it. He told me sales at the original location were still solid, but the new lease, staffing, equipment payments, and slower than expected traffic had eaten through his cushion. He had gone to our parents because he needed time, not because he expected Grandma's house to become collateral damage. There are people working there, he said. That's what Mom keeps telling me. She's right about that. I know. But if the second location has to close, that's on me. I had spent the previous 2 days assuming Nolan was somewhere waiting to be rescued. Now he sounded almost as confused by my parents' plan as I had been when Caleb called. What exactly did Mom promise? He asked. I'm trying to find out. After we hung up, I drove to Grandma's house to meet the independent appraiser I had arranged. I didn't need another emotional tour of the rooms. I needed one answer. Were my parents unloading the property for far less than it was worth because they needed cash immediately? The answer turned out to be less dramatic and more useful. Caleb's offer was reasonable. It wasn't a giveaway, but it reflected the convenience of a fast, uncomplicated closing. With more time and normal marketing, the house might bring more. That mattered because it eliminated one easy explanation. My parents weren't secretly handing a valuable property to someone for half its value. They were paying for speed. When I stepped onto Grandma's back porch afterward, I called Caleb. I told him there was a genuine family issue affecting my consent and that I couldn't promise the original timeline. He surprised me by saying, I'd rather know now than find out at the closing table. He wasn't happy, but he didn't threaten me or pressure me. The person with the least connection to my family was somehow the only one treating my signature like it belonged to me. Dad finally emailed the financial information that evening. It wasn't everything I had requested, but it was more than Mom had given me. There were summaries of the business credit, estimated proceeds from Grandma's house, and several columns of dates. I'm not an accountant, so most of the numbers took time to understand. Then one line stopped me. Expected property proceeds committed. Beside it was a date. I checked it against the listing record because I thought I had misremembered. I hadn't. The date was 6 weeks before Grandma's house had even been listed for sale. I read the phrase again. Expected property proceeds committed. My parents hadn't found a buyer and then realized the money could help Nolan. They had been counting on the house before there was a buyer at all, and before anyone had asked whether I would consent to selling it. I emailed Dad one question. What does committed mean? He didn't answer by email. 5 minutes later my phone rang. Mara, he said quietly, we need to talk. Then talk. Not over the phone. I waited. And I think it needs to be without your mother there. That was the moment the question changed for me. I was no longer trying to find out why my parents wanted Grandma's house sold quickly. I knew why. What I needed to know now was how far they had already gone before deciding my signature was something they could collect afterward. Dad chose a diner 20 minutes from my parents' house, the kind of place where nobody cared how long you sat over one cup of coffee. When I arrived, he was already in a booth with a folder beside him. Does Mom know you're here? I asked. She knows I'm out. That answer told me what kind of conversation this was going to be. I sat across from him and put a copy of the financial summary on the table. What does committed mean? Dad looked at the line for a long moment, even though he clearly knew exactly which one I meant. When Nolan opened the second location, your mother and I backed part of the credit he needed. Backed how? We guaranteed a portion of it personally. I thought about Mom repeatedly describing this as Nolan's business problem. So when you said or exposure, you meant yours and Mom's. Dad nodded. He explained that Nolan had put his own money into the expansion, but the lender wanted additional security. My parents believed the second location would stabilize within a year, so they agreed to guarantee part of the credit line. At first, it looked manageable. Then costs rose, sales came in below projections, and Nolan began using more of the available credit just to keep the new location operating. Why didn't you tell me any of this when I asked? I said. Because we didn't need your money. You needed my signature. Dad looked down. Yes. He opened the folder and slid a few pages toward me. There were projections showing several ways they could reduce their exposure. Grandma's house appeared in one of them, then it appeared in another. The earliest version was dated months before her death. This is what Grandma was talking about, I said. Dad didn't pretend not to understand. Your mother saw the house as an asset nobody was going to use. Grandma was still living there when this was written. It was a future option, nothing more at that point. And after she died. Dad rubbed the edge of his coffee cup with his thumb. Lane wanted to move quickly. That still wasn't the whole answer. When did you decide the sale money was going toward the guarantee? He exhaled. Before we listed. I sat back. There it was. Not a forged deed. Not some elaborate theft. Something almost more familiar than that. My parents had made a plan, assumed I would eventually agree with it, and kept moving until my agreement became the last unfinished item. Dad told me Mom had spoken with their financial advisor about reducing the guarantee using expected proceeds from the property. That was what committed meant. The money hadn't literally been transferred or legally pledged before the sale, but their repayment plan depended on it. They had started making other decisions based on the assumption that Grandma's house would close on schedule. Did you tell her to ask me first? I asked. I told her we should explain everything before the listing. And she thought you'd worry. She said you'd want more time, more information, another appraisal. I almost smiled at the accuracy. She was right. I know. And you went along with her anyway. Dad didn't defend himself. I thought the house should be sold regardless. I told myself the order didn't matter if we ended up in the same place. That was probably the most honest thing he had said to me since Caleb called. Dad hadn't been tricked by Mom. He had disagreed, then chosen the easier path because he believed the final decision would justify how they reached it. What happens if I don't sign this sale? I asked. Really happens. Not the version where everyone loses everything by Friday. He looked almost embarrassed. We restructure. Meaning? Nolan probably closes the second location. Your mother and I move some investments. We may sell another asset. The bank gets paid more slowly. We take a loss. Do you lose your house? No. Does Nolan lose the original business? Not necessarily. The original location is still profitable. I stared at him. For days I had been hearing about employees and deadlines and permanent damage. There were consequences, serious ones. But the missing signature was not standing between my family and financial destruction. It was standing between them and a painful admission that the expansion had failed. Does Nolan know you guaranteed the credit? I asked. He knows we guaranteed some of it. Does he know you were counting on Grandma's house to get out of it? Dad shook his head. I left the diner disappointed in both of my parents, but strangely less afraid of saying no. The crisis was real. The version of the crisis I had been given was not. Dad called Nolan that afternoon before I could. Nolan rang me that evening. His voice sounded different from the day before. Dad told me everything. Are you okay? Not particularly. He gave a short, humorless laugh. I thought they were helping me bridge a bad year. I didn't know they were rearranging their finances around Grandma's house. What are you going to do? Close the second location if I have to. He said it slowly, like saying it aloud made the failure official. I should have done it 2 months ago. I reminded him about the employees Mom had mentioned. I know. I'm trying to move whoever I can to the original store. But keeping a bad location open, because I'm ashamed to close it, doesn't protect them forever. Then he said the one thing I hadn't expected from him. Don't sign for me, Mara. I didn't answer immediately. If you decide selling the house makes sense, fine. But don't sign because Mom makes you think my business disappears if you don't. By the end of that call, the family arrangement had shifted again. Nolan, the person I had assumed everyone was trying to rescue, was willing to accept the consequence. Dad had finally admitted there were alternatives. I was willing to consider selling the house. That left Mom. Her voicemail came less than an hour later. She didn't yell. She sounded tired. Your father has apparently decided every private financial decision we've ever made is now a family meeting. Nolan is talking about closing the store, and you've turned one signature into a judgment on how we've handled this family for years. She paused. When she continued, her voice was quieter. Someone has to keep this family from falling apart, Mara. Apparently I'm still the only person willing to do it. I listened to the message twice. The first time I heard accusation. The second time I heard fear. Mom was still fighting for the original sale, even after the financial reason for rushing it had started disappearing. Which meant this was no longer only about the money. I called her back and asked her to meet me the next afternoon at Grandma's house. It was time to find out what she actually thought she was saving. Mom was already inside Grandma's house when I arrived the next afternoon. Most of the furniture was gone, and without Grandma's books, plants, and framed photographs. The rooms looked larger than I remembered. Mom stood at the kitchen counter with the unsigned consent page beside her. For a second, neither of us mentioned it. Nolan is closing the second location, she said. I know. Your father thinks restructuring is manageable. He showed me the numbers. Mom gave a small nod. Of course he did. There was more hurt than anger in her voice. I could have started by listing everything she had hidden from me. Instead, I asked the question I had come there to ask. Why are you still trying to make this sale happen on the original deadline? She looked genuinely surprised. Because it's still the best option? Even if Nolan closes the second location. Especially then, we take the proceeds, reduce the guarantee, clean up the damage, and everybody moves forward. But there are other ways. More expensive ways. For you and Dad, her jaw tightened. Yes, Mara, for us. Because we backed our son when he was trying to build something. I'm not ashamed of that. I didn't say you should be. That seemed to stop her. She had come prepared to defend herself against an accusation I wasn't making. I pulled out one of Grandma's kitchen chairs and sat down. I'm not angry because you helped Nolan. I'm angry because you decided my answer before you asked me. Mom looked toward the window over the sink. I knew what would happen if I asked you too early. You would want documents. You would want another appraisal. You would question whether Nolan's business deserved the money. Meanwhile, the deadline would keep getting closer. So you made all those decisions first. I made progress. And left my consent until the end because I believed you would understand. There it was again. Understand in my family. That word had always sounded like a compliment. Suddenly I could hear the obligation hidden inside it. Mom walked into the dining room, and I followed her. Pale rectangles marked the walls where Grandma's pictures had hung. Do you know what happens in this family when nobody takes charge? She asked. Everyone waits. Your father avoids the uncomfortable conversation. Nolan believes another good month will fix a bad quarter. You ask for more information, and eventually the problem gets worse. So you fix it. Someone has to. She said it quietly. No performance. No attempt to make me feel guilty. That was when I finally understood why she was still fighting after the original emergency had become manageable. Selling Grandma's house on schedule wasn't only about the guarantee anymore. If the deal closed, Mom's plan worked. Nolan's failed expansion became a financial problem she had solved. Dad didn't have to sell anything he cared about. Nobody had to sit with the fact that they had made a bad bet. Mom could remain the person who fixed things before they looked broken. What happens if you don't fix this one? I asked. Her eyes moved to mine. We lose money. That's not what I asked. She looked away. It took her a while to answer. Then maybe I was wrong. There was no dramatic confession after that. She didn't suddenly apologize for everything. She just stood in her mother's empty dining room and looked tired. I understood her better in that moment than I had at any point since Caleb called me. I also knew understanding her didn't require me to sign. I took Grandma's letter from my bag. There's something you should read. Mom frowned when she recognized the handwriting. What is that? Why Grandma put my name on the property. Mom read the first page standing up. By the second she sat down, I watched her reach the part I had read over and over. The house was not a monument. Sell it if selling made sense. Mom looked up. So she did want it sold. That isn't what she said. She said you didn't have to keep it. Exactly? I pointed to the next paragraph. She didn't give me authority, so I could automatically say no to you. She gave it to me so somebody had to stop and ask why. I told Mom the two questions. Why now? Where does the money go? This time she didn't answer immediately because we both already knew. Now, because she and Dad had committed themselves to Nolan's expansion. The money, because they wanted to erase as much of that decision as possible before accepting the alternatives. Grandma thought I couldn't be trusted, Mom said. I think Grandma knew what you do when you're scared. Mom's expression hardened. And what is that supposed to mean? You move faster. You solve. You make the decision before anybody can slow you down. That kept this family functioning for 30 years. Probably. She hadn't expected me to agree. But this time the thing slowing you down was my consent. I slid the letter toward her. And you decided consent was something you could collect after everything else was done. The house was silent around us. Finally Mom looked at the unsigned page on the kitchen counter. So what are you going to do? I had spent days believing that was the hardest question. By then, it wasn't. I'm not signing this contract. Her face changed immediately. Mara. I'm not saying the house can never be sold. She stopped. I think it probably should be sold. Neither of us is moving into it. Leaving it empty indefinitely makes no sense. But I'm not approving a transaction that was built around a deadline you created before asking me. Caleb may walk. I know. The next offer could be lower. Or higher, we don't know. Hand the business deadline. Nolan is closing the second location. Dad said you can restructure the guarantee. At a cost. Yes. I didn't soften that word. At a cost. Mom stared at me. You're willing to let us take that loss to prove a point? No. I'm willing to let the people who made the decision deal with its cost, instead of using Grandma's house to make the cost disappear. I told her what I was willing to do next. Review a properly marketed sale, look at an independent valuation, see the proposed distribution before anyone committed the money, and make my decision before an offer was treated as inevitable. If the numbers made sense, I would sign. Mom looked at the letter again. Do you understand what happens when we miss the deadline? Yes. And I did. That mattered. I wasn't refusing because I didn't understand the consequences. I was refusing because, for the first time, everyone had finally explained them. I picked up my bag and walked toward the front door. The consent page stayed on Grandma's kitchen counter. I didn't tear it up. I didn't take it with me. I simply left the signature line blank. The closing deadline was the next morning. For the first time since Caleb's call, nobody in my family could pretend my answer was still on its way. The closing date passed without anything dramatic happening. I woke up that morning half expecting my phone to be full of angry messages or some new emergency that would make me question everything I had decided. Instead, Caleb sent me one short email saying he couldn't keep the original timeline open indefinitely and would step away if the transaction couldn't proceed. I understood. I thanked him for contacting me in the first place. Mom didn't call. Dad sent a message saying they were meeting with their financial advisor that afternoon. Nolan was the only one who called me. I told the staff this morning, he said. He was closing the second location at the end of the month. A few employees could move to the original store. Others couldn't. Nolan didn't pretend that part was painless. I should have made this decision before Mom and Dad ever got involved, he said. I kept thinking one strong month would change everything. For once, nobody asked me to make that realization cheaper. Over the next several weeks, the disaster I had been warned about turned into something much less dramatic and much more real. Mom and Dad restructured the portion of the credit they had guaranteed. They moved some investments and sold an asset they actually controlled. They lost money. Nolan negotiated his way out of part of the second lease, sold equipment, and concentrated on the original location. It hurt, but the original business survived. My parents kept their home. Nobody's life collapsed. What disappeared was the possibility of making the failed expansion almost painless by converting Grandma's house into emergency cash. Mom and I barely spoke during that period. Dad called occasionally. Nolan and I actually talked more than we had in years, although we never turned what happened into some grand sibling reconciliation. He had made a bad business decision. My parents had made another one, trying to protect him from it. I had spent years making my own smaller mistake by assuming that being the reasonable person meant letting other people finish decisions before I asked questions. About 4 months later, Dad called and said they were considering listing Grandma's house again. This time the sentence was, "Considering listing, not, we sold it. A new appraisal came first." Then I received the proposed listing agreement. When an offer arrived several weeks later, Mom emailed me the entire package before anyone accepted it. The offer was actually better than Caleb's had been. More important to me, there was no artificial deadline attached to it. The business guarantee was already being handled separately. The sale proceeds would go where the ownership documents said they should go, not directly into somebody else's rescue plan. I read everything twice. Then Mom called. We had been talking carefully by then, the way people do when they're trying to rebuild something without pretending it never broke. "Have you had enough time to look at it?" she asked. It was such a small question that someone else might not have noticed anything unusual about it. I did. "Yes," I said. "I think this sale makes sense." There was a pause. "So do I." I signed the consent page that afternoon. The strange thing was that putting my name on that line didn't feel like surrendering Grandma's house. It felt like finally understanding why Grandma had put my name there in the first place. She had never asked me to protect a building forever. She knew the house would probably be sold someday. What she protected was the pause before that decision. The moment when somebody had to ask why it was happening now, where the money was going, and whether urgency was being used to make everyone else's choices for them. A month after the new owners moved in, I drove past the house. There were unfamiliar curtains in the front windows and 2 bicycles leaning against the porch. For a second, I missed seeing Grandma there more than I expected. Then I kept driving. Mom never gave me a dramatic apology. Dad never asked me to tell him he had been forgiven. Nolan never turned his failed expansion into some inspiring success story. Things just changed in smaller ways. Mom started sending information before making family plans that involved me. Dad became a little less willing to hide behind her decisions. Nolan stopped treating staying open at any cost as proof that his business was successful. And I stopped hearing, "We handled it," as a reason not to ask what had actually been handled. When Caleb first called me, I thought the missing signature meant there was something wrong with the sale. By the end, I understood the signature itself had never been the real problem. The problem was that my family had already written the rest of the story and assumed I would add my name at the bottom. Grandma had left me one small way to make sure that didn't happen. In the end, I sold the house anyway. I just made sure that when I finally said yes, it was actually my answer.